Hello there and welcome to the Bardo podcast. My name is Marc Salmon. I'm a comedian and a practicing Buddhist, and I need a lot to practice. I also spent much of my working life in adult social care. This is a podcast about philosophy, comedy, and hopeful and alternative ways of thinking. So welcome. In today's episode, I'm joined by Gabriel Kennedy, also known as Proper Nom. He's a writer, a musician, a researcher whose work explores counterculture, conspiracy thinking and belief systems. And today we're going to be discussing his magnificent book, Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. Excellent biography of one of the most underrated thinkers of the 20th century, and full disclosure, my favourite author. If you've never come across Robert Anton Wilson before, hopefully this podcast will serve as a good introduction. I'd say that reading his work is like a psychedelic experience. And he promoted ideas like reality tunnels and maybe logic, which are ways of thinking that treat belief systems as provisional maps rather than final truths. In this conversation, Gabriel and I talk about Robert Anton Wilson and Gabriel's fantastic book. We also explore humour as a survival strategy, uncertainty, and what it might mean to loosen our grips on the stories we tell ourselves about reality. And just a quick note before we begin, Gabriel's internet was unfortunately down, so he had to record on his end in a coffee shop. I've hopefully cleaned up the audio where I can and made cuts where needed, so please bear with us. So, let's loosen our grip a little bit, relax, and float downstream as we enter the Bardo. How are you though at the moment? How's things over there?
It is wild, honestly. Because you have your day-to-day life, which you're just taking care of your A, B, and C's, trying to pay the rent, and then you turn on the news, and it's total chaos. So, and then those ICE raids came to Los Angeles first in June, so we sort of got acquainted with the brutal techniques and of what they've been using and the insipid fascism that's sneaking into, well, more like kicking down the door of this country right now,
Yeah. It seems like there's been like quite a lot of resistance though on the people coming out on the streets. Having to bearing in mind that Palantir is working against them and actively sort of hunting people down, having to be quite clever in their strategies.
100%. It's taking another, it got kicked up to another level in Minnesota. It was called, ICE has been naming their operations like their, military operations. And it really is like a chickens coming home to roost situation for America because, since at least World War II, spending decades of, American foreign policy has been kind of like what ICE is doing to its own citizens now, so it's wild. And to see it play out in my lifetime, like in live action, it's, you have to remind yourself that it's not a movie and this is real life and you have to act appropriately. And and so part of that is the resistance and the courts in America, the judges on like circuit level and state levels, so I don't know if it's similar to the UK in a way, but the court systems, the judicial system in America, we have like, local and then circuit level judges and then state level judges. And then if something gets tried and it gets won, someone can appeal it and then it gets kicked up to the higher judicial level until it hits the Supreme Court. And somehow Trump and his like Cobra Commander minions they've kind of captured the Supreme Court. And so that's been part of the struggle here. But the circuit level and state level judges have been sticking to the rule of law, basically, and smacking down a lot of these sort of, very photogenic, photo op, flashy things that Trump and ICE, Trump loves to do these things. So he'll arrest a bunch of people, but then they'll just get released, shortly thereafter, because a judge will be like, this is total BS. So that resistance has been very strong. Like, Robert Anton Wilson used to sort of joke about presidents of America. He called like Richard Nixon the anarchist president, because he motivated people to actually look into anarchism as a solution to his bullshit. And so I'd say like Trump is like the Constitution president. Like he's motivating people to study the Constitution like never before, to be very aware of their constitutional rights, because ICE is just stomping on those rights every single day that it's in existence right now. They're a Gestapo, and 2/3 of America are against all this stuff right now. But authoritarian regimes don't need public support. That's what makes them so sneaky and messed up. Like learning this very, very quickly, that like, how Hitler rose to power and the Nazis rose to power. He only had support of a few idiots, right? And the Liberal Party was completely weakened and unable to fight the Nazis, and so this, I'm sure Europe is watching this like, come on guys, because it's up to Americans, like to stop this. And we're holding strong, man. We're holding strong. Hey man, it's not a Discordian.
Yeah.
When you write about a Discordian, chaos happens, man.
Yeah. You've invoked Eris right now.
Oh yeah, she's been with me for a few years, bro.
So let's give a little bit of context. So I read your book, Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe how much I enjoyed it. I've been a huge Raw fan since I was a young man. My uncle, I had like a weird hippie uncle, and he bought me Illuminatus trilogy and said, check this out. And I couldn't put it down. And ever since, I've been absolutely hooked. Like I'd say the majority of things, that was like my Rosetta Stone. Like the majority of things I'm even interested in life, like anarchism, Buddhism, magic, all comes from Bob. So, I mean, I'd love to know like how you came about writing the book.
Yes. I'd say it was super organic, Mark. I discovered Robert Anton Wilson my senior year of high school with the Illuminatus trilogy. I read it during the summer, from high school to first year of college. And it completely captured my attention, from the cover, the 1997 Dell cover, to, the open quote from Ishmael Reed that Bob, sourced, from the book Mumbo Jumbo, which was like, if I remember offhand, like the secret history of the history of the world is the history of, battles between secret societies, something like that. And, that really sparked off an interest that I didn't know I had at the time, but from reading Illuminatus and the rest of Bob's work, the study of deep politics, to borrow the phrase from the writer Peter Dale Scott, which is now pretty much a field of study, which is to, seek to analyze the goings on behind the scenes for all the major political events that we see around us today, and our study of power, right? Wilson definitely was part of a lineage that sought to study power and how this, that there is the elite class and how they behave. And, so this was sort of like, it's been like a growing field of study throughout the whole 20th century, from like Charles Beard, the historian, to, like I said, Peter Dale Scott and Robert Anton Wilson and others. So, I didn't know that at the time when I read Illuminatus. Like it's cleverly disguised as just like a satire of conspiracy theories, but he's, him and Robert Shea are really seeking to implement a systematic way of sort of analyzing conspiracy theories and seeking to understand, how humans behave, when they're in groups and whatnot. So it was an extremely inspiring book. And then, as I said, I went into college, and kind of Wilson became like my source. Like I would like sort of take these classes and then sort of check in with, compare and contrast to what I've read through Wilson. And I think it was like sophomore year, I read Cosmic Trigger and Prometheus Rising. I discovered, the interlibrary loan system, which was amazing. That was, you can basically borrow any book, seemingly in America through your college library. And I read those two books over the summer as well, and they were extremely inspiring, mostly on like the sort of like psychological level, Wilson's and Timothy Leary's Eighth Circuit model of intelligence completely grabbed my attention for many, many years, as I, sought to, I don't know, I guess, give myself a full, cipher of an education through utilizing the sources that Wilson and Leary, cited within their model of consciousness. And so I thought that was pretty cool. Like, reading Illuminatus made me, Wilson and Shea's use of guerrilla ontology, where, mixing fact and fiction, but done so in a way that inspires you to want to actually look up the historical reference. Some people, they've read Illuminatus and they didn't do that. But I think I got the two Bob's message, which is check this stuff out, like hit the stacks, hit the shelves, and do some research about these things that we're talking about. So, he was a complete inspiration for so many years, man. And it just organically grew from there. Like, reading all his stuff to, I saw him speak at, I read about this in my book, Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, that, I attended the Synfo conference at Hammerstein Ballroom in New York City in, I think the year 2000. Yeah. And I went there to see Bob speak, but while there, I got introduced to so many other interesting and fun writers like Grant Morrison, and Douglas Rushkoff was there. Genesis Peorage, who's an interesting artist. Kembra Falver, like who did this amazing performance at the end of the night. Joe Coleman, who basically set his chest on fire, with Roman candles that he fired out into the audience, pre 9/11. And so that was like a really pivotal sort of personal event. Like, and then of course I met Bob. I met Bob that night. I brought a copy of Illuminatus trilogy, and like he signed it for me and stuff like that. And I was like, yeah. And then, not long after that, in 2003, I traveled, to Santa Cruz, California to attend the, Maybe Logic, The Lives and Ideas of Robert Anton Wilson, the documentary about Robert Anton Wilson. I saw that premiere in Santa Cruz, and it was on July 23rd, 2003. And so it was really awesome being in the audience and watching that. And then I met David J. Brown that night, and he like basically hooked up an interview for me and Bob. Like, I think it was the day after or the 2 days after, something like that. It was totally on the fly. Like, I told them I wrote for a magazine that I just made up in the moment. I just wanted to, I was like, at that point, Robert Anton Wilson was like my favorite living artist, far beyond anyone else I could think of. So, and he was, old and in a wheelchair, and like, it seemed like I still believe that he was gonna like rise from the wheelchair and get better and stuff. But I attended that movie premiere and got to interview him a couple of days later. And that sort of, in some ways, became the seed of this biography, even though I didn't know it until over 20 years later. Because, in 2004, Wilson and the director of that documentary, Lance Bauscher, created this thing called the Maybe Logic Academy, which was an online remote sort of learning hub that was really ahead of its time, because what happened during COVID, so many schools went online and remote, and they're pretty much using the same exact format that Wilson used for the Maybe Logic Academy, this asynchronous learning format where there were weekly assignments, presented by a teacher or a facilitator. Wilson was the beginning of it, but there are a lot of other teachers that came along in the course of its, multi-year existence. And Bob, as I said, the MLA started in July 2004, and he passed away in January 2007. So for like those 2.5 years, like he was going hard with like going through almost all of his work, pretty much all of his work, and teaching or leading classes, if you will, around those works. For instance, the first class that he taught was about Illuminatus trilogy. So it was a 12-week course. And, each week was dedicated to one of the books. There are 10 books in Illuminatus trilogy. And then there was like further discussion thereafter. So it was just a really awesome place to, unpack the writing of this guy who, like you, it just totally inspired so many different avenues of cognition. And, me and about, I'd say, 22 others out of like 200 or 300 people that passed through Maybe Logic. We were involved in almost everything. We were like a core group, shout out to the Maybe Logic Academy heads, I was in a good part of my life at that time. I was able to take a number of these classes, and I did. And as I said, Bob passed away in 2007. And it was around then that I was like, I was already making music. I was, kind of had like a parallel sort of, I was very involved in the hip hop scene, and like the underground music scene in New York City and other places. And so I was touring, and I was kind of building up very organically my own craft. And so those things aligned nicely after Bob passed away in a certain sense. And, I knew I wanted to write a book. I just didn't land yet on the biography of Robert Anton Wilson. There was a number of other, like I have like 2 novels that I'd been working on, and like, another sort of nonfiction book. And, but, to really get the engine turning to work on a multi-year project, I found, you have to be completely passionate about the subject. And, this was one area that I was, because it took many, many years to finally create this book. But long story short, this was a very organic process that happened, sort of like the slow distillation of coffee. It wasn't just like, I'm a writer and I want to figure out someone interesting to write about. No, oh, hey, this guy, Robert Anton Wilson, has not had a book made about him yet. No, this took a very long time, and I'm very grateful to have gotten it out in time for the biography of Robert Anton Wilson that I wrote to be the first biography. And then in that, I wanted to set the bar so high, like I want to intimidate people, like who want to write a book about it, because man, that's the way it has to be.
Yeah.
Like to toast an artist like Wilson, who didn't get a lot of attention during his lifetime beyond sort of cult status, even though he hung out with, some major writers and intellectuals and artists. And I felt like it's just necessary right now for, the greater intellectual world to present the biography and get Wilson more well known, right? And then we roast him. Then we critically analyze his work,
Yeah. I guess in the words of Bukowski, you got to go all the way. You got to go for it. And so
100%.
How do we even begin to describe to people who don't know who Bob was? You touched upon a few things there. You mentioned guerrilla ontology and, Illuminatus itself. He would often describe it as he was trying to get you into a state of metanoia, to sort of help you see that your belief systems are a little bit less fixed than you might think they are. That you might just be a cosmic schmuck, was his words. How do we begin to even describe this man who did he had so many different things going on?
Yeah, he's kind of hard to pin down, right? Perhaps that's one reason why it's taken such time for him to catch on, maybe. But yeah, I would simply describe him as like an American novelist, pretty influential voice of the 1960s, 1970s American counterculture, American and European counterculture. And he's, very much like that band, the Fugs, who with Ed Sanders and Tully Kupferberg. And the Fugs were this like early 60s beatnik proto punk band. The spirit was like this, total punk thing. And it was like the Fugs and John Peel down on the Lower East Side, like really getting this thing going. And Wilson is like that. He's like this proto, writer of today. His voice is very relevant for today, the way that he, was extremely experimental in all of his novels and all of his books from fiction to nonfiction, because he liked invoking all the new communication technologies. So he's an interesting experimentalist in that sense, but the simplest way to describe him is just as an American novelist, a satirist, and a very important voice of the 1960s, 1970s counterculture, which inspired a huge inspiration to sort of like that cyberdelic techno-utopian revolution, that quote unquote revolution that occurred in the 90s and early 2000s.
I mean, there's so many threads that we can follow right now as well with his work. And I think something that he was a master sort of synthesizer. He would take together so many disparate ideas, from quantum physics to occultism to, radical politics. And something I enjoyed about your book, Gabriel, was that how it's almost like it's a history in a sense of last century. It's got so much context around everything. I thought it just, for people who maybe haven't even read Raw, I think it just adds a great introduction and a great context to his work. There's a great backdrop. But how do you think?
Thank you, man.
Yeah, so it was great. I really, really loved it, man. But how do you think that? How could we say that Raw's relevant to people now? I mean, there's so many things. The first thing that comes to mind for me is his use of model agnosticism. But maybe we could unpack that a little bit.
For sure, yeah. So model agnosticism, very simply put, is the notion of this religious agnosticism that basically you're saying that there could be a God, or maybe there isn't a God. We don't totally know, and that's okay. We spent I don't know how many 2,000 years or something, or maybe more, in this sort of monotheistic battle, this either or, either there's a God, you're either a theist or an atheist. And Wilson believed he had enough experiences in life to make him uncertain about such matters. And that uncertainty is not a curse. It's sort of like a Zen koan. It's walking with a doubt about one's perceptions at times, that brings a certain epistemological humility. So meaning that humans are creating maps all the time to describe the world around them and experience through themselves, but we constantly mistake these maps for the outside territory, for reality as it is. So there's reality as we interpret it, and then communicate that in every way that we communicate, from obscene hand gestures to words to painting to our everything. All those are expressions of ourselves interpreting the world. And Wilson firmly believed that we forget this all the time. We constantly mistake our maps for the territories, and therein is one reason why people get into so many fights, because their interpretation of what's going on, they get an emotional fixation on needing that interpretation to be agreed upon as the consensus of this is the way things are. And a lot of religion has functioned that way, same with cults and corporate structures. And as Wilson goes deeper into basically presenting this model agnosticism, we do this in any type of group if we're not aware. So the model agnosticism is looking at basically, any philosophical description of the world, any social scientific, any description of the world through, a lens of maybe, right? And this may or may not describe the world as it is, including my own descriptions of the world. Because if you look at the way that you see the world through that lens, you'll find your favorite ways of describing the world. And you'll find, as he said, what the thinker thinks, the prover proves. You'll basically, have confirmation bias, and we have confirmation bias way more than we are even aware of. That's just the way our minds are constructed at this point in evolution, constantly fooling ourselves and then trying to get other people to fool themselves too. And that's the folly. And when we're watching it on TV, it's comedy, but when we're living it in real life, it's tragedy, And so to be a model agnostic, it's essentially just to, have less of a hardcore fixated view of the world and introduce a number of, well, it could be this way, it could be that way. But that model agnosticism needs to be, that could easily fall into solipsism if you don't train your mind for critical thinking.
Yeah.
And that's what made Wilson different from what I saw from that he got placed with New Age thinkers. Yeah. They just didn't seem to have a real method of critical inquiry, and Wilson at least talked about that a lot to want to increase the critical thinking skills in his readers. And that's, I thought that from reading him, I wanted to increase my critical thinking skills. So maybe accomplish something there. So yeah, model agnosticism and the ability to negotiate, the ability, and that's around vital things, like how we could figure out how to negotiate around resources and, and humans are not, some humans are really bad at that right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's much needed as well, because I think of these. So Bob used the term reality tunnel, which was sort of coined by Timothy Leary, and I think the idea of capitalist realism at the moment, that everything seems so oppressive as well, with the rise of fascism, that it may seem that there are no alternatives. And so I think there's a direct revolutionary potential as well to model agnosticism, because it challenges so many orthodoxies, not just inner but also outer. One thing I liked about in your book, so in Cosmic Trigger, he uses lots of different the multiple selves of Raw, and at the end of your book there's a list of the 24 different selves of Raw, basically. And so for everything from the mystic to the rationalist. And I think that was another way, as you said, of him not falling into sort of similar patterns as the New Age, because it became about, there was even a critique of his own methods as well, which I think was very important. So in terms of writing the book then, how did you, because Raw was a sort of slippery character, as we sort of said, he had lots of different interests, and he was talking about a variety of topics. What was your sources for even bringing this together? It's so well researched. I'm wondering what was the process?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. Thank you for asking. It was, much like, it was very organic again. It started with my own sort of research of original source material. Well, firstly, Wilson's writings, and just constantly going back to his text, and then seeking to corroborate some of his stories and getting a fuller understanding of his life. I interviewed approximately 70 people for the book. I think a little bit more, but I wrote 70 in the back of the book, and that started with his daughter Christina, who is the executor of the the raw trust. And so for a little over a year, I talked to her very frequently, maybe once a week. And so she provided a very nice kind of biographical sketch. And then everything just sort of, blossomed out from there, right? I spoke to through the writing of this book, Wilson's other surviving children, Alex, and then also Graham, who doesn't make many press appearances, if you will. And that was great. Just connecting with, the Wilsons themselves was really nice. It was a very special part of this. This book, it wasn't just writing, this dry piece of documentation. Like, it was like choosing to, like, it worked through me as well. I ingested these, some, like, the events that happened. It was almost like cosmic trigger in a way. Like, right. So for instance, I started seeing UFOs at the beginning of writing this book, right? Yeah. Like, it started with seeing the day before Halloween, an orange globe orb floating over the trees, just across the horizon. And it was insane. And then pulled over to film it. And just as I took out my camera to film it, it disappeared. Yeah. Right. And for the next number of years writing this book, also happened to be outside a lot and looking up at the stars at night. Just saw so many unidentified flying objects in the sky, like mostly just crazy moving lights moving at extremely fast speeds in the night sky, that it's impossible for any known technology, to produce that. And so I thought, and then when I wrapped up the book, and got it out, and say over this last year and change, like, haven't been outside as much at night, and those UFOs they're gone. And I just think that's quite fitting, because this goes right to the source of what Wilson is, one of the things that he's exploring, especially in Cosmic Trigger, which is what happens when you start seeing things that you're not supposed to see, and is that objectively happening out there? Is that some sort of like synthesis between your own nervous system and what you're seeing, compounded with what you're studying? And I found that happen a number of times. And as I said, Wilson talks about that a lot. So the interviews unfolded, one to the next. And as I said, over the course of the, I guess, 7 years writing the book, it became 70 people. I had the time to go in depth with other people too, like one of Wilson's friends from the 70s, the particle physicist Saul Paul Sarag, who I had a number of sort of interview correspondences with. He like tutored me in quantum physics and like M theory, which I thought was great, because he was pretty much like the tutor in a way of Wilson in the 70s for quantum physics. Tutor might not be the right word, but he gave Wilson the chart for the breakdown of quantum physics that ended up in Cosmic Trigger. So those interviews were really, fruitful. And then I also dug into a lot of special collections. So that's like going to specific libraries throughout the United States. Some I was able to go to physically, like the ones in New York. And then some I, was given the help of like awesome independent sort of researchers, like in Chicago. I should say the staff is being very nice here too, because they turned the music down a little bit, which was nice.
That's good.
So, yeah.
You say, I'm an important writer. Turn this music down.
Yeah. Don't you understand?
We're talking about art here.
Yeah. You ever watch, this is a kind of tangent, but any of those Coen Brothers movies?
Yeah, I love them, yeah.
And that movie Barton Fink.
Oh, it's the best, yeah.
With John Turturro. Yeah. And he goes to that USO dance, and he's all excited because he finished his screenplay, and he's dancing with the pretty ladies, and this sailor wants to cut in, and he's like, you don't understand. I am a writer. And then the guy punches him out.
Yeah.
That's kind of the life of a writer, you know what I mean? But, yeah.
All right, so we were talking about the sources that you came up with. Something you touched upon there was maybe we could talk a little bit about high strangeness, because this is something that follows Robert Anton Wilson's writings around, and once you read this stuff as well, you'll end up having more, as you said, and I've had as well, you'll end up having synchronicities in your own life as you become more attuned to that frequency, I think. So could you maybe talk a little bit about sort of Bob's relationship, maybe specifically in Cosmic Trigger, he started receiving signals which he interpreted in different ways.
For sure. Yeah. And, this is Cosmic Trigger introduced the term Chapel Perilous to my lexicon, and probably many people's lexicon, since he published the book in 1977. And, Wilson writes that he entered Chapel Perilous in, the early 70s, triggered by his, practice of thelemic magic, reading Aleister Crowley, and sort of committing to the Crowleyan curriculum of consciousness exploration, coupled with, doing a lot of acid and studying, reading about the occult. So as I said, Wilson was exploring all of these, really sort of, topics that could engage his deeper psychological self. He was also exploring Jungian psychology during all of this period from, roughly 1971 to 1977 that he documents in Cosmic Trigger. And he enters, this area that of sort of like interpretation of the world around him that he utilizes the metaphor Chapel Perilous for, which is that, strange and uncanny and weird things were manifesting in his life that sort of coincided with what he was thinking about, simply put, what he was writing about. And, that's where that term synchronicity, comes in. And I'd say Wilson was a part of introducing that term to the wider public as well there in like the 70s. And, synchronicity, meaning like in time, within personal time. It was the physicist Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung who sort of came up with the term when they wrote a book called Synchronicity years before, when exploring quantum physics, and this notion that hugely personal events happening for people that resonate deeply with something inside them. And it could be what they were thinking about, or it could be something very, very deep. And these are things that, it's like a dreams, dreams mean something personal to you. But if you try to explain your dream to your coworker, quickly they lose interest.
Yeah.
And, Wilson was just such a skilled writer, really, at what he was really great at. Because one could criticize some of the way Wilson wrote as well. He wrote a lot in the passive voice, right? But in terms of telling a great yarn, and he's sort of like Henry Miller in that regard. Like, he just lays stuff down, and he let you in his personal world in Cosmic Trigger, and did it so well that it just inspired so many readers like myself to want to learn more about first off, exploring a lot of weird shit, not being afraid of it, and and then being able to make sense of it in a way that doesn't make you a crazy kook conspiracy theorist like moron, as the people who are running America right now. So Wilson took inspiration with the term Chapel Perilous from the work of T.S. Eliot, his poem "The Wasteland," who was inspired by a folklorist who wrote a book called I think it was Jesse Weston was the name, who wrote a book called From Ritual to Romance, which studied the Arthurian legend and saw those stories as like sort of like an initiation process for something pre-Christianity perhaps, or early Christianity. I'm not, like, those Arthurian legends were leftover remnants of an older story, so Weston said. And the point of this initiation process was like, it was to prepare you for the initiation. And so I think that's kind of interesting, that this notion of Chapel Perilous isn't the whole process itself. It's to prepare you for something else. And within the Arthurian legends, like the notion of the perilous chapel was written about, like, I think first, in the 15th century, in a poem from Thomas Malory. And the Arthurian legends are great because they're like, these sort of original comic books, fan fiction, like all these great writers keep adding on to the story. And this metaphor and trope of a perilous chapel that an ardent searcher, a knight, or comes across on their journey for the Holy Grail. And it's a place where, other knights have gone, and, searchers have gone and have been killed or have gotten, sick or whatnot. The chapel is haunted, essentially. And it's, one enters the chapel in some ways in order to heal the chapel and then heal themselves in the process. Or as the story that I relate in my book, Sir Lancelot needs to go to the chapel to grab like a piece of cloth from a knight that was injured there in order to heal that knight, so I think it's a very rich metaphor, and Wilson did something very creative when he applied that metaphor to an interior journey that he himself, went on, and a journey that he's a great, as you said, like synthesizer. He sort of synthesized this Arthurian, very European, Celtic sort of story with a Zen approach, right? And he was part of this generation of like rise of American Zen as well. He explored Buddhism a lot in his life. And so there's that sort of Zen phrase where, at first the mountain is the mountain, and then the mountain is way more than the mountain. And then you go through your little journey, and then the mountain is the mountain again. And Wilson definitely did the full cipher because, by the 90s, he was asked in an interview from Richard Metzger, which I write about in my book, to go in depth about Cosmic Trigger. And Bob off the mic said to Richard, he's like, hey man, like, I don't really want to go into that much. Like, I don't believe that stuff anymore that I was writing about, but I want the readers to go through that themselves. Yeah. Right. Which I thought was very interesting. That's the type of artist that he was, inspired by people like Orson Welles and say E.E. Cummings and Ezra Pound and James Joyce, which you give the reader enough to be inspired to do a lot of work on their own. Yeah. Some artists, and especially now, nowadays, they're just throwing everything at the audience, like, look at me, and Bob, of course, was gnomic and occultic, and just was a type of artist that has existed for a very long time. And so the whole notion of Chapel Perilous completely fits with his MO.
Another thing about Bob as well is it's just goddamn fun, isn't it? Like, I'm actually reading Master of the Illuminati at the moment, which I'd never read, actually. I hadn't read that one. And even his fiction is, as you said, putting you through a process of transformation in reading it. And it's just, every single page is an absolute delight. Like, it's just incredible. Totally. So I'd like to maybe talk about his life. He had cult status, as you said, but he had lots of struggles financially throughout his life, and he had a lot of difficulties. And one place I wanted to start is at Gegner's barbershop. And when he had a family at the time, but he was actually arrested for civil disobedience.
He was, yes. Yeah, that was a really heroic action from Wilson. Um, and he writes about, I first learned about this, as did readers of Wilson, from his book Cosmic Trigger Volume 2, Down to Earth, which he published, I think, around 1991, and was published on New Falcon Press. New Falcon was, an indie publisher, and even though it had like kind of cool status, it didn't get a lot of coverage and press, so adding to Wilson's, niche appeal. And in that book, Wilson describes in the early 1960s, he was living in Yellow Springs, Ohio with his young family, his 4 children and pets and his wife. And he was around 30 years old, and the civil rights struggle was in full swing, especially in Ohio. And for nearly 20 years, the struggle had been going on in Ohio to, do a number of things, but also desegregate the local businesses. It was like the Civil Rights Association. They worked really hard, and they were, while they were doing activism, the law was changing to make it necessary for businesses to desegregate. And long story short, Wilson got involved in that struggle. There was one local shop that was a holdout and basically breaking the law by staying segregated, and that was a local barbershop owned by this guy Gegner. And he would refuse service to it was a male barbershop, so to black male customers, saying to them, "I don't know how to cut Negro hair." That was his excuse. And the civil rights local organization was like, okay, this is the final battle here. We have to compel him to abide by the law. And they did so. And there was a meeting held one night, and Wilson was hip to Yellow Springs, Ohio is a very small town. I've been there. It's a very like rural sort of place. And someone spoke, and Wilson was going to volunteer for a civil disobedience action. But then he heard this person talk about the risks involved, and one could get arrested and spend much time in prison. That's what they were holding over people's heads back then, much like today in America, the risk of spending time in prison for standing up for your neighbors. He had like a dark night of the soul that night. He was going to do it, and then he said, "Oh no, I have to be there for my family. I can't do this." But then the next day he woke up and he remembered the Freedom Riders, and these were the people who traveled to southern states in order to help, bring voting rights, to implement the Voting Rights Act that was passed in America, because of all the racism that Black Americans faced. They disempowered the vote from Black people. They took that away from people. And these civil rights activists traveled to really entrenched southern states, tons of white racists around. And some of them were killed. 3 of them were killed in close to that time that Wilson was going to do this action. And so it was a very, tumultuous time. So long story short, Wilson chose to take part in the action, and he got arrested. And the action consisted of going into the barbershop. It wasn't anything crazy, but saying it was him and another white guy, and then like 2 or 3 black guys. And the black guys went in first, and then Bob and some other white dude went in, and Gegner turned to them and said, "May I help you?" And they're like, "Well, I think they're first. They were before me. I prefer you cut their hair first." And he'd say, "I don't know how to cut Negro hair." You know what I mean? And they're like, "Well, we're not leaving until you cut their hair. And he called the police, and then they got arrested, and for trespassing or something. And that was in July. I have it in my book. I believe it was July 1963. And so now this is where the story gets interesting, is that Wilson's recounting of the tale, as told in Cosmic Trigger Volume 2, he says that action, shortly after that action, Gegner's barbershop closed down. So instead of abiding by the law, he just shut it down because he was a stubborn old white racist jerk off, And then he ended up going to the little further south and giving talks with the KKK.
Right.
So that's who the likes they're dealing with, And but so when I was writing the book, I wanted to corroborate the story and add more context to it.
Yeah.
And I was speaking to people from Yellow Springs who took part in the civil rights action back then, which was really great. Like, I had the time to really go deep in my interviews. And, I spoke to one guy named Paul Graham, who was, a part of that civil rights organization from the get-go. And then I spoke with, this guy named Lee Morgan, who was the son or grandson of Ernest Morgan. And Ernest Morgan, the Morgan family are a big family in Yellow Springs. And Wilson worked for the Morgans and rented a house from Ernest Morgan too. And Lee Morgan, when I reached out to him and asked him I sent him the little bit that Wilson wrote about the protests, and he was like, "Yeah, that's a great story, but this guy wasn't there."
Yeah.
And I was like, "What? No. Lee, maybe you're a little mistaken. I mean, this is, and long story short, Wilson wasn't there. Wilson wasn't at the last protest, because that last protest that basically shut Gegner's shop down was in March 1964, and it made national headlines that night, made the national news because it was a huge, the police came out and I think unleashed water cannons on Antioch students and, all types of chaos. And Lee Morgan was like, "Yeah, man, I knew everyone who was protesting and your guy was not there." And so I sat with that for a while and I was very perturbed, and I couldn't find any corroboration. And I'm like, "What is Bob lying? What is this?" Right? And months go by, and another writer who has done a lot of research on Robert Anton Wilson, a writer named Jesse Walker, who has written a very interesting book about conspiracy theories. I think it's the United States of Paranoia. Very good book. He found the AP article that chronicled Wilson being arrested for the civil disobedience action that actually occurred in July 1963 and not March 1964. And thankfully, I got my hands on that clipping and I put it in my book. And so that's probably one of the best examples of Wilson's slipperiness, if you will, because mind you, Wilson was writing, he traveled, he moved around constantly. There was no internet. I was, like I said, in 2003, I was at his apartment. The man barely had a bookshelf. I was blown away. I'm like, where the fuck is this guy's books? But he moved around so much, he accumulated stuff and then he let it go. And so he worked a lot off of his memory, right? So, but that's a pretty big flub, getting mixed up on, however, he wrote that in 1991 about an event that happened nearly 30 years earlier.
Yeah.
And so I was glad to really be able to thread through that and find, obviously give the actual story. Wilson embraced guerrilla ontology in his fiction, but I think in his personal life, he tried to be mostly as, on point as possible. But when he wasn't, I got to check it out and find the right story.
Yeah. I guess the point of interest for me with that story, was that sort of sense of personal sacrifice in that, despite the consequences. But earlier, and you write about this in the book, about Wilson's upbringing in the Catholic school, and he was physically abused essentially by nuns, and that solidified a sense of anti-authoritarianism in him. And I wonder if we could speak a little bit about Raw's approach to authority and how he didn't become dogmatic in how he approached that himself.
For sure, yes. Yeah, that was another thing that I was able to kind of spend some time really investigating, if you will, Wilson's early life. And he doesn't write a lot about this, but he does document in his work that the nuns at his Catholic grammar school, which was Resurrection School in Garrison Beach, Brooklyn, in the South Shores of Brooklyn. You know, how abusive the nuns were, both physically and psychologically, how they seemed to take great joy in wrapping the young knuckles of children with yardsticks, steel or wooden. But even more troubling, psychological torture, if you will, telling stories to these children about the book, you know, the eternal suffering Job of the Bible, who loved God so much that God made a bet with the devil that Job loved him so much that the devil could make his life living hell and Job would still love him. I guess God was bored, you know? Yeah. And so the nuns telling Bob the story about the devil sprinkling ground glass into Job's eyes as he slept, causing blindness, like, you know, psychologically tortured Bob. And the only parallel I could think in my life was like when I watched the trauma movie Class of Nukem High.
Yeah.
at the very beginning, when like that nerd drinks water from the toxified water fountain in the high school hallway and then turns into a toxic monster, you know, in first period. Like, that trauma movie traumatized me. I didn't drink water for like I thought it was 2 weeks, but it was probably like 2 days.
Yeah.
And so Bob was completely traumatized by this story. And he heard before he went into high school that the Christian brothers who led the high school were even worse than the nuns. So his first act of liberation really was to liberate himself from Catholic school hell, a nice Irish Catholic brand of hell. And he applied for and got into one of the most prestigious high schools in the country, which was Brooklyn Technical School in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, where he attended high school. But before I go to that topic, Wilson let out only in a couple of articles that his mother had also abused him when he was a child. He described himself as a quote unquote battered child. I came across one sort of little known article of his that, with information he didn't include in Cosmic Trigger 2, which was a story about, you know, how his mom just started spontaneously beating on him when he was probably like 7, you know, or 8 for a few years thereafter. And then she suddenly stopped as he got a little bit older and then never did it again. But he told a story about how, being a child, the bruises on his arms were so bad from his mom, I guess, punching him, that he, in order to deflect attention to that, he jumped out his school window and like made it seem like he was injured from that.
Yeah.
And you know, Wilson, I found that to be extremely interesting, because as many doors as he opened in his life and that he wrote about, there were things that I'd say, things that he explored that he did not write about because they were very personal for him. You know, he didn't spend a lot of time sort of writing about external, abuse
Yeah.
of mothers to sons. But I think there's something in his work though that carries through. Like he has a great sensitivity towards mean women. He thinks mean women are, really are just as bad as mean, abusive men for the rest of his life,
Hello there, just a quick pause to let you know that if you're enjoying the Bardo podcast and you'd like to support it financially, you can do that at patreon.com/the Bardo podcast. There's also a link in the show notes. The podcast will always be independent, ad-free and available to everyone. But if you are able to support even a small amount in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, it genuinely helps with the time and costs that go into making it. I am a working class artist and that support really does make a difference in me being able to keep having these conversations. Over on Patreon, I'm also going to be starting a fortnightly online meditation session soon, just a simple space to sit together. No experience required, no pressure, just a chance to pause and practice together. You'll be able to join either as a paid supporter or, if money's tight right now, free member as well. I'll be sharing details about that too on Instagram. All right, let's get back to the conversation. So Raw became interested in anarchism, and I wonder if we could speak a little bit about that, Raw's relationship to anarchism.
100%. Yeah. And that, Wilson's relationship to the, political approach of anarchism, the political philosophy of anarchism, it also coincides with then his approach to feminism, which, he credits Arlen, his wife, for discovering the Encyclopedia Britannica entry on anarchism written by Prince Peter Kropotkin.
Yeah, Kropotkin.
Who was the the Russian, I don't know, was he a biologist? He was a Russian count, and then also a scientist. And from his time in nature, basically observing animals, he saw how much animals actually cooperate, cross-species cooperation, more than pure competition for resources. And such an experience inspired Kropotkin to write the book Mutual Aid, where he believed that humans will benefit way more from cooperating with one another than viciously, ruthlessly competing with one another, which flew in the face of the social Darwinism that was so popular at the time. And in the early 60s, I think it was 1961, Arlen discovered that encyclopedia entry from Kropotkin. Around the same time, they discovered the work of Ralph Barsotti, a little known sort of American agrarian philosopher who started the organization called the School of Living, which based off of a couple of books that Barsotti wrote, started a sort of like self-reliance organization in Ohio. And that's what brought Bob and Arlen and the family to Ohio. Wilson was so inspired by discovering Kropotkin and also Ralph Barsotti, who represented the sort of third way in American philosophical, political traditions. Barsotti was within a lineage of this thinker named Henry George, who was a 19th century journalist and I don't know, like I don't know if we call him a social scientist, but George wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, which was a huge hit because he basically asked the question, like, why in America in this early 1900s or late 1800s, when there's an industrial revolution going on, why in cities like San Francisco, there's more poor people than ever before? Why have we made so much technological progress, yet there's still more poverty? And this is nearly 100 years later. And all this great technology that we have, why are there homeless people everywhere? And so Henry George, landed on an idea and a solution, and that idea and solution trickled down to Ralph Barsotti, who sought to implement these things in the School of Living. And Barsotti was also influenced by a tradition of American individualist anarchists. And Wilson discovered that through basically maybe Barsotti, that there was this there's the tradition of European anarchists, which is like P.J. Proudhon, sort of came up with the whole thing. But, there were American anarchists too, people like Josiah Warren, who was in Ohio, who created like time banking, an interesting type of alternative currency. There were people like Benjamin R. Tucker, Lysander Spooner, Joseph Labadie, and others. William G. Green, I think is, and what Wilson really got into with all that was essentially like Proudhon's proposition that there should be a people's bank.
Yes.
And that credit should be readily available for everybody within a community, credit that should not have interest charges attached to it, because that's usury. And usury is what destroys cultures and civilizations, rots it out from the core, according to, Ezra Pound, of which Wilson was a big, fan of some of his work, some of his ideas. And so, Wilson went all in on exploring this full spectrum of anarchism, way before the internet. So his, kind of time at the School of Living, he read all these books from individualist anarchists, and then he discovered the work of Emma Goldman, and this sort of European, if you will, anarchism. But the whole thing of anarchism is it's anarchism. It's not, there's no nations, it's us.
Yes.
You know what I mean? It's the people of the earth, man. It's not nation state anarchism, right? And but there are collectivist anarchist sort of stuff and individualist anarchist sort of stuff. Benjamin R. Tucker, individualist anarchist, Emma Goldman, collectivist anarchist, and maybe there are some differences. Syndicalism, a little bit different. And then as time progresses, Bob discovers Max Stirner and egoist anarchism, which around 1965, he's not an agnostic at this point. He considers himself an atheist, and he becomes friendly with Madeline Murray O'Hare, who becomes known as like the kind of preeminent atheist in America and American society for many years. And Bob, like so many wild, interesting thinkers, Bob meets her at like the beginning of her ascent. He writes articles about her for Fact Magazine, an early publication that Bob wrote for in the 60s. And he then starts writing for her journal, which was, I think, American Atheist. And now it's like a glossy magazine. And then it was like a newsletter. And Bob's doing like movie reviews. He's a contributing editor. But he's building, he's really going in on exploring atheism, but along with egoist anarchism, again, of Max Stirner. And a big point of that, for Bob at least, was that we are programmed to basically mix up obligation with love, right? And we need, and that gets taken advantage of by the bastards higher up the pyramid, the shit pyramid, right? They shit down on us and tell us that Jesus got his head shit on, and so should you, so to speak. Like, just meaning you got to take a lot of shit. And what Bob basically was deprogramming this Irish Catholic guilt that he received as a kid by exploring atheism and egoist anarchism, which really broke stuff down. Like, these things are not real. These creations like Santa Claus and God, you can't describe it in physical reality. These are what he called spooks in our heads that like haunt us, and we have to rid our minds from these thought forms that don't have any power over us, and then as the late 60s turn to the early 70s, Wilson is at the forefront, if you will, of this rise of the libertarian perspective. As I write in my book, Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, libertarianism, it became sort of like had like a zeitgeist moment in the late 60s, early 70s. Some describe it as like this kind of first wave of sort of libertarianism. Someone like Murray Rothbard was like the big face of it. And Rothbard talked a lot about Benjamin R. Tucker. But Bob, of course, being somewhat contrarian, he had his own take on Rothbard. And Wilson ended up sort of joining forces with a guy named Samuel Edward Konkin III, who had a really cool acronym. It was like a graffiti acronym, Seek 3, You know what I mean? I feel like I could see that graffitied on the wall. And, Konkin represented this thing called agorism. He was into this agorist sort of anarchism, which was this sort of voluntary, he called it counter economics, or gray economics. So meaning like break the law in different ways, like, these things shouldn't be taxed. You could be a gun runner, a drug dealer, a pimp, a prostitute, this is very 70s outlaw sort of gonzo, Hunter S. Thompson, guns blazing, the Eagles are playing on your fucking cassette, smoking a tiny joint. But what Wilson was sort of gravitating to mostly was this, what got described as left libertarianism. He was friendly with this writer, a very interesting writer named Carl Oglesby, who is sort of this, should be mentioned in the lineage of Peter Dale Scott and Charles Beard as presenting a theory of interpreting power and the elite with Oglesby's book, The Yankee and Cowboy War, which Bob referenced and cited a lot because it coincides with sort of Wilson's approach to deep politics, if you will, which was what he presented somewhat in the Illuminatus trilogy, that there are things going on behind the scenes that we're not told about. It's expressed through propaganda and PR, and it's the job of a good investigative journalist to try to find out what the story is. And Carl Oglesby, he sort of really represented left libertarianism. And, Bob really carried that torch for a while. And then as the 80s shifted to the 90s and then into the early 2000s, Bob just started calling himself an anarchist again. And, by the early 2000s, I wouldn't say it was like fuck shit up anarchism, but it was more like fuck you anarchism, like, and meaning punching up, never punching down. Like he was very clear, like in a 2001 interview, that over the last number of decades, America had become a pure oligarchy. He was asked in a interview, like, well, what conspiracy theory seems most true to you? And he said, well, I'd rate it about a 9.5, that America's not really a democracy, it's an oligarchy. And I was able to, I put in my book that 15 years later, along come two political scientists from the Ivy League universities, Princeton and Yale, I think, who conducted a thorough, research project studying the last 40 years in American political policy history, and really seeing like this idea of the majoritarian democracy is not true in practice. Elite moneyed interests have way more power than the everyday person on the street, and coalitions and groups of people. And that has increased since the time of Reagan to today. And the manifestation of Trump is it's taken 40 years to slide down the shithole, and, so that was a very sobering sort of take, because it's like, well, what sort of work does it take to get out of this, And so by the end of his life, Wilson was just sort of like stressing, like, read the Constitution. Just if you're an American, study the Constitution. And then he started this thing, or I wouldn't say he started it because it's someone else who came up with it, but he started really promoting the Guns and Dope Party, yes. Which in America right now, it's kind of interesting that the Republican president is anti-gun, anti-2A, Second Amendment, if you will, after, someone got murdered by ICE thugs because he had, and we're what Wilson and Shea wrote about Illuminatus trilogy, where they sought to create a story when total evil meets total stupidity.
Yeah.
Like, that's America right now.
Yeah. Something that you mentioned there about Raw punching up. He had the SNAFU Principle, and this was the idea that communication could never be equal. It couldn't flow freely between people that aren't equal.
Yes, yeah. That's a great, really interesting take on things. I think I first discovered that, and maybe you first discovered it too in Prometheus Rising. Where he described the sort of like the pyramid of of nescience or omniscience, So the SNAFU principle states that, communication can only take place between equals.
Yeah.
However, most structures of organizational structures right now are hierarchical. And such a hierarchical structure, especially in the realm of politics or high pressure corporations, require both a burden of nescience from meaning and a burden of omniscience. So meaning those at the top, specifically, the very top of the pyramid, that person, the head of the corporation, has to go around acting like they know absolutely everything that's going on beneath them because it's their corporation. They're in charge. They're the boss. They have to know. Even when they don't know, right? They have to pretend like they know. And then those beneath the big boss man or woman have the burden of nescience, which is they have to habitually act like they don't know, even if they do know, meaning they have to act like they don't know in comparison to the boss. So if the boss doesn't know something, they have to first feel out where the boss is at to tell them just enough of what they think is the truth. Wilson, I remember first reading that, it just hit with so much reality. He'd often give the example of like, people lie all the time to police, because, when the police have an authority backed by a gun, right? Once you have that, that's a different type of authority in different situations. That cop may go off duty with no gun and be a total schlub and schmuck themselves. And then they get pulled over by a cop and they lie to the other cop. Police do this, right? They lie to each other all the time. And, but that's because of this notion of, this central authority or a top of the pyramid authority. And within a structure like that, Wilson built a very interesting kind of sociological framework, going from what would be like such such a framework would promote organizational stupidity because communication is not flowing freely, then all the facts about a situation at hand are not known. And the further along this type of closed structure continues, it's going to collapse in on itself, according to Wilson's logic. And because it's diversity and that brings most strength and the ability for different systems to integrate, the reality from those being reported from the ground. And I know I haven't dived down this rabbit hole yet, but I think within this area, there have been some Wilson heads that have explored the work of Deleuze and Guattari from this. And I think that's very worthwhile. I'd like to go down that road.
I'm very interested in the rhizome at the moment, actually. I've been thinking a lot about that. And I can totally see how that tracks, actually, the SNAFU principle. Also, Habermas as well. I think it was Habermas had a same thing. He would call it distorted communication. Anyway, that's a tangent. But something I love about Raw is his use of humour and playfulness as almost like epistemological tools in themselves, not just as like gimmicks. And in Cosmic Trigger, he has contact from signals that he perceives in different ways. In some ways, he says that they might be contact from Sirius, the dog star. And then I believe he goes on to interpret them as... maybe this is a separate situation, actually, but he starts to have contact with a puka and a 6-foot bunny rabbit called Harvey. And not just that, discordianism itself. Play and humour is a rich thread throughout Raw's work.
100%. Yeah, and to sort of invoke the work of Habermas there a little bit as well, this approach to, the ludic approach to everything, the playful approach. I think Wilson he had that sort of hilaritas, if you will, from a very young age. As the Monty Python song goes, always look on the bright side of life. life's a piece of shit, so why not laugh at
Yeah.
it? It all depends on your perspective. Wilson suffered from polio as a child. Like, he suffered, man. Like, he talked about, that's one of the first things he got acquainted with was this crippling pain, spasms in his legs as like a 3-year-old in his crib. So he learned firsthand the power of laughter. Truly, laughter is medicine. Wilson is a proponent of that, and he really is able to communicate that, and a teacher of that. To help remind people you gotta laugh to get through this existence, because if you don't, you might not be that fun to be around, but yeah, sort of that's the interesting thing though. So you mentioned Discordianism, and Discordianism is described as what is it, a religion disguised as a joke, or a joke disguised as a religion. And of course, Wilson was a voice of this kind of 1960s acid culture. And we know that acid and weed can make people laugh a lot, right? And it seemed like it was, and he was also, in a social circle in the 50s to early 60s with the rise of this new stand-up, the stand-up comedy world that we live in today. It was Paul Krasner who hired him to write at The Realist, the first big break that Wilson got. The Realist is the sort of prototypical freaking awesome satirical political magazine, and Paul Krasner was homies with Lenny Bruce. And George Carlin discovered the work of Robert Anton Wilson by reading The Realist before George Carlin became the George Carlin that we know. And as I document in my book, I interviewed George Carlin's daughter, Kelly Carlin, who said that when George died, she found something that he'd written that said, a list of my heroes, and then in parentheses, sort of. Right. And Robert Anton Wilson was at the top of the list, man. That's huge. Right. And so, you get Paul Krasner was also a stand-up comedian too. So you have this weird nexus of Lenny Bruce, George Carlin, Paul Krasner, Robert Anton Wilson. And then Tom Robbins also discovers Robert Anton Wilson through reading The Realist. And Robbins is funny as shit, and it's just this sort of, one could go two directions maybe in 20th century literature, this sort of observing the stark madness and insanity of the human mind, and how we could create holocausts and genocides, in the blink of an eye. That's horrible. That's a hard image to look at in the mirror. And then, one can choose to stay in touch with humor and good humor through all of this. And through that laughter, try to build some compassion. And, one can use laughter as a weapon, and one could use laughter as a salve, as a healer. And, one thing that Bob did, which I thought was really fun, was he created I don't know if he created it, but he utilized a magical ritual. And that was, if there's someone quote unquote psychically attacking you, or maybe is really hard to deal with in your life, get a picture of them, put it in the center of a circle, and you and your friends, or maybe just you, sit around the circle and just laugh at this picture. Laugh, 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 laugh. And it's sort of like a laughter yoga. But this, is working to liberate yourself from whatever negative feelings you may have towards this person. And it might kind of, as I said, there's that phrase within recovery talk or AA that, resentment is resentment at people is like drinking a poison and hoping that they get sick, but really it's you that's getting sick. So, Wilson learned that early on, and perhaps in his, and it was always reinforced that, laughter is truly a medicine. And I feel like I've been lucky enough to discover that in my life too. And that was one thing that I really wanted to get across in the book too, was this humor, this hilaritas of Bob, man. Like, cause when you're there, when you're going through it, yes, you can look at how hard it is, et cetera, but that's not going to get you off the couch, man. Either the anger is going to motivate you, or like the laughter is going to like just help you, and Bob wrote about that. He's like, my work is like filled with anger and laughter. And like, how could you not live in the 20th? How could you live in the 20th century and not have those two feelings, like an absurdity, how absurd all of this is. He even said at the end of his life, like his last message to the world was, he's like, I can't be afraid of death. This is absurd to me. And, and he was really in touch with that. And I think, he traveled to, he was always in tune, say, with his Irish Americanness, if you will. He was raised, as he said, like within like an Irish Catholic ghetto in South Brooklyn in Garrison Beach. And in 1982, for 6 years, he moved to and lived in Dublin, Ireland with his wife, Arlen. So from 82 to 88. And this is kind of like Wilson's lost years, if you will, in terms of like resources and things to cite. I had to do a bit of digging to find like he doesn't write about his day-to-day life so much in published work. I was able to access these letters, tons of letters that he wrote at that time, to delineate his day-to-day. But I mean, he loved the humor of Irish people. Like, he thought they were hilarious. Like, it was like right, from James Joyce to the everyday cab driver. Like, he just thought they were so funny. Big time. And then that extended to the British, the whole UK, like Ireland and UK. Like, he just loved it, man. Of course, he was a huge fan of Monty Python, and he loved to laugh. I just think that's
Yeah, it's true. His work is just so funny and full of humor all the way through. And one thing I do want to touch upon as well is forgiveness, because Raw had a really heartbreaking tragedy happen to him. And, I went to see Daisy Ellis Campbell's play of Cosmic Trigger when it was over in London. It was amazing. And it was a beautiful adaptation of it. And the final secret of the Illuminati, he says, is between fear and love. That's the choice. I don't know if we want to speak about the tragedy. Maybe we keep that. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, like, I could, if you want, I get into it a little bit, because that was one of the things I was able to unpack a little bit more and provide a little bit more context around in my book. Because it didn't seem like Bob wanted to get much into the tragedy in his own life too. His family, like, they basically, so what happened was in 1976, his daughter Luna, 15-year-old daughter, was murdered not far from their house in Berkeley, California, at her after-school job at a vintage clothing store on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and Berkeley, California. And it was the afternoon, and someone came in a supposed robbery and took her to the back, tied her up, and then smashed her head in with a heavy credit card machine that they had back in the day, and stole like $50 from the cash register. He never writes about the name of the person. He only really mentions it once in his work, and that's in Cosmic Trigger Volume 1. He just says that the guy was a Sioux Indian who was sort of like a drifter and an alcoholic. And and so through some interviews, I found out the guy's name. His name was Narcissus Lebeau. And I spent some time looking into his life on a Synchronicity, my process of, digging into his life, because there were so many things I had to look into. And I didn't quite have a lot of money at the time. but I wanted to do like one of those been verified things, like sign up from one of those websites to look up this guy to see if he was still around. And I had it in the back of my mind, but I forgot it. And I was working on something else in the book. Then one day I got paid from work. I had an extra $30 to spare at that time. So I was like, man, I'm just going to sign up for this thing and check and go on another tangent. Like, I'll just leave this thing, middle sentence, and I just got struck with this feeling to start looking up Hector Leboeuf, Narcissus Leboeuf. And lo and behold, I went through a whole cycle and I found out a lot of stuff about him. And then I reflected later on and I said, holy shit. Like, I got hit with that idea to start looking into this guy's life on his birthday. So this man, and he was dead. He passed away some years earlier, but on the day on his birthday, I got the idea to start looking this guy up, and I was really struck by that. And this guy who murdered Luna, he ended up going into like this firefighting program in prison, and it gave him like a reduced sentence, which was kind of messed up. He got out of prison fairly early for murdering a 15-year-old girl. But I spoke to like some, in my research, I contacted the Prison Bureau of California, and I was sent Leboeuf's prison record. And that's how I was able to see where he was and when he got released. And I think he got released in 1981, which is like 5 years in prison pretty much. And but Leboeuf spent time in this firefighting sort of program where they fought like major like firefighter fires in California, which those are huge fires. So I thought that was wild. And I looked into his life. I went so far as almost getting in touch with possibly his daughter. It turns out he was might have been from the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota. And so yeah, that was interesting going down that path. And I sourced the original news clippings of reporting Luna's murder. And yeah, to be honest, Mark, that was like, there were a number of times writing the book, where I was deeply emotionally struck from being so close to observe like another human being's life. It's a sort of profound experience. It was very, very deep in some ways, and I was really affected by that. Like, yeah, man, I really, really mourned the death of Luna, man. I really did. Like 50 years later, like something interesting. And so, yeah, Wilson, it destroyed the family in many ways. As his daughter Christina says, the tenuous threads that were holding the family together, and they were quite tenuous, kind of broke and shattered after that. And there's his son Graham. Well, first off, Arlen kind of went into like a almost catatonic depression, and she would only perk up when Bob was around, right? And then their son Graham had a schizophrenic break like shortly after Luna was murdered, and he's still struggles with this, to this day. And it hit him really hard, and his hallucinations were really bad. Like he saw flames coming off the walls of his bedroom. He thought his family were like trying to kill him. Like he got hit so hard, and it happened so quick. And they were still so in mourning of Luna's death that they didn't quite know how to handle it so much. And, I'd say Wilson within his parameters tried. And, he had a friend who was a psychologist, an actual like a psychiatrist who, saw Graham, and, they really tried to care for him, but Wilson didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't have health insurance. And when Bob and Arlen and Graham, they moved from their house in Berkeley, and then they moved to another house. And then when Bob started making a little bit of money from his writing, they were able to move to San Francisco to like a high-rise apartment building where actually Sam Rockwell grew up, the actor. And this was in, as I said, in San Francisco. And, you know, Wilson was just, his career was really starting to really take off, and he was so funny, and he was telling all these funny stories and all these lectures that he was giving and making people laugh. But when he would come home, his son was a complete wreck and started like threatening to kill himself and stuff like that, and would be having these, like, just wouldn't even call them fights, just screaming at his parents with like a butcher's knife to his own wrist or his own neck, and acting like he was just gonna just kill himself. And so like Bob was like so chill, and he might have been using, you know, some Thorazine from time to time with that, you know, to like deal with some of that. But, you know, he would go home to like this crisis that didn't end until him and Arlen sort of left and went to Ireland in 1982. And he sort of left Graham to the care of Christina and Alexandra. And they felt that, you know, their parents sort of just like dumped Graham and his illness onto them, because schizophrenia is like, what I learned, it's such a major disease and we don't have a handle on it. Like the amount of care that a schizophrenic person requires, especially in America, and Reagan is to blame for this. He's the one that shut down and closed all these asylums in the early 80s and dumped. This was one reason why there's so many homeless people in America. You know, it's not the immigrants. It was a Republican president who started this, you know what I mean? And like Graham just kind of, they tried to be there for him and he would fall through some cracks, and then it was just a really hard thing, you know, and the struggle for his own life too. That's this whole other story, you know. And but you know, that tragedy just became a major bifurcation in Wilson's life. And that happened, you know, that happened to Arlen and that happened to Graham. But what Bob did was, he didn't have therapy at the time. All he had was his writing, and he poured all of this into his work. I think Schrödinger's Cat Trilogy and Masks of the Illuminati a little bit, but really Schrödinger's Cat Trilogy, which he wrote and produced shortly after Luna's murder and Graham's descent into schizophrenia. He does something really brilliant as far as fiction writing goes. Some writers, they're lazy AF, and they quote unquote produce fiction, which is, they barely provide any cover of the people that they're sourcing in their lives. They might just change the name and describe everything else and then totally shit on that person in the book. Like, I know he's not a good person to talk about right now, but Woody Allen, you know, he's got a scene from his movie Deconstructing Harry where, you know, a character is confronting a Woody Allen type character and being like, you asshole, you write about all of us and you barely even cover it up. You know, like Bob did something really amazing with Schrödinger's Cat Trilogy, where he took everything from his life and he put it in like a creative blender, and he created all these interesting characters, and he really sourced his life well. But the point is that he chose multiple characters to express his intense grief and sadness and depression through, like the character Benny Eggs Benedict, who he writes about his mother being brutally murdered in Brooklyn as she was walking home. And then from then on, he starts seeing the face of the grinning sadist in every corner and crevice around him. And that description of like the trope of the grinning sadist and all these, you know, like schlock B movies that he saw growing up, you know, the typical like psycho killer. And like, I imagine this is what Bob was experiencing from time to time, this intense anxiety, and how could he feel safe? And on top of that, the last instigating incident that led him and Arlen to say, yo, fuck this, we got to get out of America and go to Ireland somewhere, was a neighbor of theirs got murdered in that housing complex in San Francisco. And it was a neighbor that was just a few doors down from them, a young woman. And at the time, they didn't know who killed her. So it was like, this woman just got murdered in their apartment building, in the parking garage of their building. And he was also afraid now of his old friend and fellow Discordian, Carrie Thornley, who had apparently also descended and had a schizophrenic break a little bit before Graham had a schizophrenic break. And Carrie Thornley, according to Bob, was starting to, send him sort of inflammatory letters. And, Bob thought that Carrie Thornley might be hiding in the bushes one day with a gun and just roll up on him and pop him in the head. Like, Bob was shook. He had been through the emotional ringer. He was burnt out. And Luna's murder, sadly, was, probably started that. And yeah, he wraps up Cosmic Trigger Volume 1 in a very poetic and beautiful way, and it was reflected nicely, as you say, and I believe it in Daisy Campbell's I didn't get to see it in Daisy Campbell's play, but that emphasis on choosing love over fear, and forgiveness over resentment, because as he was told by one of those angelic voices during his travels in Chapel Perilous, that those who are happiest forgive most, and he really tried to, at least in his work, live by that axiom, if you will, and he sought to forgive this man who murdered his daughter. And one thing that I guess helped him move through the pain and anger and resentment was to focus on this idea of intergenerational trauma and, what Native Americans have experienced in this country at the hands of white men and white women, but mostly white men, and the total destruction of their life. And then and Wilson saw, even though his people were from Ireland and Trieste, we're not in America during that time of the westward expansion. Wilson still processed it like that, and it did help him move past some resentment, because he saw it all as this giant wheel of karma, and hurt people. Yeah. And I know someone whose daughter was brutally murdered in a really messed up way, and he didn't move past it. He's not in a good way, this guy that I know, and it's been a number of years since his daughter was brutally murdered. So this thing can destroy your life. And, from everything that I could tell in my investigations of Bob, art was there for him. His writing, that's the ultimate test of your art. It's not books sold, movies, anyone, I spent many years as like an MC, and like, man, I wish so many times I rhymed to like, an empty, two people in the audience, but I gave it my all, because that's the most important thing you have to do, because it's for them, but it's for you. It's, Nietzsche talks about it like the Rausch or whatever, Rausch or something like that, maybe, like this, what art is really about. It's your medicine, and it's not a surprise that Wilson read Nietzsche when he was depressed, and he did a lot of acid and smoked weed, and and did his own sort of exercises that helped him sort of stay present as much as possible and not get stuck. Because when you're holding on to pain, it holds you from the present moment. That's what PTSD is. And Arlen his whole family had PTSD from the murder of Luna, and so did Bob. But Bob utilized his art to process that a little bit, which I think is great.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really, great retelling of everything. And it especially struck me when you said that you were living with this when you were reading through these letters. I was working with a guy. I have a background of working in adult social care, and I was working with this guy I'd never even met him, and his brother had died, and we had to go through all his letters. And it's amazing how much you pick up from, this was a person I'd never met, from this. So that really resonated, and I think that was a lovely tribute. And one thing I wanted to mention before we go was I actually had a synchronicity around Paideia. I think it's pronounced Paideia, the university. A few years ago, I was getting sober and I was meditating a lot, and I had this experience where lots of flashing lights, and this word came to me, Paideia, and I didn't know what it meant. I was like, I don't know what that is. And then I saw it in Murray Bookchin's work later, and saw it in different places, and it would always create like this, that sensation of synchronicity. Wow, I'm awake now, right? Then I was talking to some friends about setting up workshops for people, and education, right? Alternative kind of ways of thinking, stuff like this, and play. And then I read your book, and I didn't know this, but I totally forgot, because I'd read like Prometheus Rising about 15 years before, and I completely forgot about that it was Paideia University at the start. That's the university that the book was originally written for as his PhD. And I'd had no idea that Raw had made up this university until I read your book. And at that exact time, as I was reading that, I was also setting up this education sort of workshop things. It was a really lovely synchronicity.
That's great, Mark. Yeah, that's a nice story to hear, man. Yeah.
But what I wanted to end on was that Raw used all of this stuff and all of these tools and and his fiction and his non-fiction as a way of like metaprogramming. And there was hope in it that we can change ourselves. We can transform ourselves.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think that could be one of the more interesting aspects of that Eighth Circuit model of intelligence as well. That idea of the self-metaprogrammer, which, Wilson, borrowed from John C. Lilly, the neuroscientist, who, wrote about his explorations of his own consciousness in, some wild books. And like The Center of the Cyclone and The Scientist. And the idea of the self-metaprogrammer is just to utilize a term that's accepted today, it's basically neuroplasticity. It's the ability to, scientists now believe that the brain can radically educate itself, and in ways that they thought that it couldn't before, and it can change fundamentally in ways that are thought that it couldn't before. And so Wilson was utilizing that term while John C. Lilly was sort of seeking to demonstrate it in his work, as was Timothy Leary in his own work with LSD. One crux of utilizing accessing your self-metaprogrammer is being able to re-imprint yourself. And this term imprinting, comes from a scientist named Konrad Lorenz, who he was an ethologist, and he basically discovered that when he took away like a mother goose from these little geese, and he was there at a specific period of time, they imprinted him or his assistants as the mother or primary caregiver, and they would follow them around. And Leary sort of applied this this understanding to humans, and said that at specific periods of time in people's lives, probably basically up until puberty, people experience like at least 4 different major moments of imprinting. The first around feeling of safety and one with one's mother or usually mother primary caregiver, breast milk and etc. And then the second having to do with one's emotional territorial self. So when you're a toddler and kind of learning to stand up from one's all fours and walk amongst, on your 2 feet. The third is your ability to speak, the semantic circuit. So when you're learning to use words, according to Wilson and Leary, some people imprint an ability to speak better than others, and that's where the idea of autism comes in. There might be a misimprint at that stage. And then the fourth imprint being the sexual psycho circuit, which is basically one's social sexual circuit, one's relation to the world around them. And, to Leary, there were specific parts of the brain and body that got activated. And today the term imprinting is not utilized so much. It's called the critical activation period. So, psychologists find this, that there are periods in time in one's life. It's more than 4 times though, that, these critical activation periods happen with neural synapses, and we're able to sort of like take in all this information. And, according to Leary in a way, and then Wilson, a good metaphor to think about is like creating like a dam system or an irrigation system. Water flows down from the top of a mountain, and it flows down crevices that have formed over time from the flow of the water. Well, that's like our neural nets, our neural synaptic connections of our brains. We constantly reduce the experience around us to smaller segments to make sense of the world. Yet we have all this capability and potential within our own brains and system. We could become, a totally different person this time around, according to Leary, right? And learning the ability to re-imprint yourself is the ability to tap into your self-metaprogramming circuit. And, Wilson wrote, like, he spent a lot of time exploring this and doing this. And like we said, the 24 selves of Wilson and Cosmic Trigger sort of allude to this. And then he added more context later on in his book, Quantum Psychology, where he utilizes the work of someone like, Ernest Rossi, who's someone I recommend people look into, where he found that, we have these different cycles within our own system, within our own body, which is Rossi called state-specific information systems. So about every 30 to 90 minutes, we essentially become another self, right? And this ties in with the work of Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff believed we had sort of multiple selves, and the point of existence is to kind of like, syncopate all these selves together. And then Bob tied that into Jung's notion of the mandala and, basically becoming self-actualized and centered. And it's, obviously it's a really nice way to describe all of this, but the idea of the self-metaprogrammer is a major part of that. And, that's work that needs to be tested. Does this truly exist? And there are so many systems of self-help or, bullshit systems that are sold on a similar premise. Like, you have the power. Let me teach you for the power to do this.
Yeah.
Neuro-linguistic program you. You know what I mean? Well, okay, this could work and it could not work, but it's up to us to test it. And I think that's where we're at with the work of Leary and Wilson. Like, it's about time that these things get tested, because, this notion of, again, a self-metaprogrammer was stated before they came up with the idea of neuroplasticity.
Mm-hmm.
So, or at least in the popular sense.
Well, thanks, mate. I think this is a good place to end it. Before we do, I was wondering, where do you think people can, where can people start with Raw? Obviously, I recommend your book. It gives a lot of context for people, but what else can they read in conjunction with that?
I think they should start with my book.
Yeah.
Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. Yeah. Mainly because of the way that I wrote it. I think that it's like accessible to people who don't really know a lot about Wilson, because I spent a lot of time, it's not a hagiography. Mm-hmm. And it's like, try to make it like a documentary presentation of an artist. Yep. So I feel like those are the best ways to discover artists. But then, if one is adventurous, read Illuminatus trilogy. Just be prepared for mid-sentence shifts. Yeah. Cosmic Trigger's nice. It is a bit dated now. It's been 50 years almost since it's been published. But
so fun though.
Yeah. I'd say Cosmic Trigger is a great start. Yeah, definitely. Oh, and also Everything is Under Control.
Yes.
I think that book really, taps into Wilson's interest and, positive things that he had to contribute to the realm of deep politics, studying deep politics.
Yeah. Cheers, man. Where can we find out more info as well about you? About you and what you're up to.
About me?
Yeah.
Oh, right on. Cheers, man. Thank you, man. You could go to my website, chapelperilous.us.
Yeah.
I have, a bunch of my interviews about the book up on there, if you'd like to watch some of that. Also, if you want to read some of my work, you could check out my Substack, which is just GabrielPatrickKennedy.substack, I believe. And then my Medium page, which I think is Gabriel Kennedy. Yeah. So
Nice one, man. Thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it.
of course,
Yeah,
sure
it's been
thing.
great.
I appreciate. Thank you as well.
Yeah, it's been really good to sort of hear just the level of knowledge that you've acquired around this stuff is fascinating. And yeah, really, really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me,
Thanks, man. That's it for this week's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much to Gabriel Kennedy. You can check out more, as he said, at his website, chapelperilous.us, to links to all his work and his own podcast, Proper Non-Podcast, which is very good. I love Robert Anton Wilson, and I would recommend reading all of his work and checking out his lectures on YouTube in conjunction with Gabriel's book. I'd also like to recommend my partner Zoe Brownstone's stand-up special on YouTube, Zoe Brownstone, Pride and Premises. And just before I go, I want to say a quick thank you to everyone who's taken the time to leave reviews and send me messages. It means a lot. It really does. And if you can please, do subscribe, review and share it if you enjoy the show. It's very helpful to get this thing out there. And you can also support the show, as I said earlier, financially on Patreon, which helps me to keep making things like this. So we'll see you next time on The In-Between. Have a good one.